Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 415. This week the questions are taken from Guide 490 and 491 on the Armoured Cruiser First Bismarck and the Japanese aircraft carrier Junyo. The Wednesday videos on US Navy interwar carrier design, the paths they didn't take, as well as the end of 1943 for the USS Enterprise series, and the Friday videos on the Broadside's Dawn of Steel game and Drax book reviews. So let's get on with the questions. Almirante Brown asks, SMS Blucher's power plant produced almost 44,000 horsepower on sea trials for a speed of just under 26 knots, according to Jane's fighting ships of World War I. How long could Blucher safely run her engines at full power? What was the overall weight of Blucher's power plant, and can you provide the specific weights of the boilers and the engines? And if Blucher had been fitted with oil-fired boilers instead of coal-fired boilers, would that have freed up enough weight and space to give each turret its own magazine and shell room? Well, there are some different figures that are booted around in terms of how much horsepower Blucher actually generated on sea trials, but I suppose for the purpose of the question, the exact amount generated doesn't really matter too much. As for how long Blucher could safely run her engines under full power, it's going to be incredibly variable on a ship-by-ship basis, because obviously if you're running them at absolute maximum flat out beyond their standard rating, the reason for the rating is because that's the power that you can constantly run the engines at reliably and consistently. Once you get above that, you are shortening the lifespan of the engines and the other machinery, generally speaking, which could get expensive in the long run, but you're also, the closer and closer you get to theoretical maximum and then potentially beyond it, the more and more you're risking something failing in a rather spectacular manner. But whether that is going to, you're going to have maybe a small failure an hour in, a major failure an hour in, or maybe some small failure 12 hours in, or maybe nothing will break for days. Well, you're probably more likely to run out of fuel at that point. Or everything violently disassembles 15 minutes after you've got it up to full pressure. You don't know, which is why it's so risky to do. So it would depend entirely on the exact build quality of every single component in Blucher's machinery system. So unfortunately, I can't tell you exactly how long she could run her engines on absolute full power, or overload power, but I can tell you that on the law of averages, it wouldn't be very long, a matter of hours at most, usually speaking. As far as the other information, the only thing I could find, and I looked through a lot of sources for this, I ended up having to go through a book that's written only in German, is that Blucher's overall machinery plant weighed 15% of her normal displacement, or about 2,370 tons. And that is obviously the boilers and the engines combined. I wasn't able to find anything about the specific weights for specific boilers and specific engines. With that said, if she had switched from oil to coal-fired boilers, then assuming you want the same amount of power output, you'd probably save maybe 300 to 400 tons, and maybe a row of boilers for a similar power output. The only slight issue with that would be then how you would arrange the magazines, because obviously, as you can see from this layout, where there's the funnels, and then you've got those the wing-mounted turrets. So you are still going to have issues without completely relocating the turrets. You're going to have issues about placement of boilers and placements of magazines. You could probably save just about enough space to have separate magazines for each of the main guns or each of the main turrets, but it could lead to issues, as was experienced with some other ships, where you have boiler rooms all around the magazines, and that leads to differences in temperature in the various magazines, which leads to different temperatures for the propellants, which leads to different performance from the guns, which can be a bit of a problem if you're actually trying to hit something. Hank the Unobtrusive asks, when building Vanguard, why did the British reuse not only the guns, but also the turrets? The limiting factor was the availability of guns, not the availability of armour, and so using a new triple 15-inch turret design would probably have made for a more efficient ship, and the existing armour on the turrets had to be replaced to be upgraded in any case. So what was the rationale there? basically saving time and money. It was far cheaper and far faster to take the existing turrets and change them so they had increased elevation and increased strengthening so they could withstand potential use of supercharges than it was to go away and build an entirely new turret. Because if you build an entirely new turret, you're also going to need new gun mountings, you're going to need a new hoist system, and you're going to need all sorts of new internals as well. And then you're going to have to make sure that as a new design system, that it all works properly. And then you've got to get somebody to manufacture it. Whereas the pre-existing turrets that they had, which they could modify, those were full turret systems, including the hoists, the elevating machinery, and all of the rams and all of this other stuff, which goes along with the guns. So it was much cheaper, quicker, and easier, and didn't impose as much stress on the armaments industry, which, remember, was trying to churn out lots and lots of different guns at that point, as well as different turret mounts, to just modify what they had and go with an 8-gun armament, because realistically, they wouldn't have gone with 4 triples. I think that would have been pushing it a little bit, considering all the other stuff they were trying to put on Vanguard. They could have gone with 3 triples, but at the end of the day, that just gives you an additional gun at the cost of all the additional expense and time in designing, building, and testing new triple gun turrets. And the idea of Vanguard was to try and get that done as quickly as possible. The Lesser Weevil asks, I love many of the images that you use during your videos. Is there some way for us to access the high-resolution images? Do you have a Google Drive or similar, or are there copyright issues? It's a little bit of a mixed bag, to be perfectly honest, because some images are ones that I have purchased or otherwise got access to. People have donated albums and so forth, at which point the original pictures belong to me, and much as I would love to have my entire picture collection hosted for everybody to use freely, one, hosting my entire picture collection would require hundreds of gigabytes of data space, which would cost a huge amount to maintain, and obviously I don't have the money to maintain a selection like that online. But separately, there is also issues with content scraping, and particularly, and I have had this issue a few times, where I own the original image, and sometimes I know because it's been an image that's been taken by a specific individual, therefore it's not a circulated image, it's something that's been in that person's ownership pretty much permanently until it's passed on to me. And now I own it, so therefore, that's the only copy that's available, and I've put the image either up on my website or I've used it in a YouTube video, and then you get some of these aggregator companies like Alamy and so forth, who they'll just steal stuff. They'll have a bot that crawls the web. They will download pictures from it. They will then host the pictures, slap their copyright over it, their watermark on it, and then they'll claim that it's theirs. And then they'll turn around and try and sue you for using your own image. I mean, just Google that. You'll find quite a number of these photo aggregator sites have ended up trying to take the original image creator to court because they've scraped that person's content and then gone after them for hosting their own content. Plus, there's also separate legal issues about the fact that anything that's been taken and published in the time period that the channel covers is well out of copyright in terms of photos. So they don't have a right to do it generally, but they do anyway. And so I do have to be a bit careful with some of my collection as to, how I host it, or if I host it at all. And that's aside from the storage issues that it would cause. But on my website, drachinifel.co.uk, I do have an albums or photos section where I do host quite a lot of images, including obviously ones that I've used at various points. And you can go and have a look at some of those. If there's a particular image that you see in a video and you think, oh, I'd like a high-res version of that, then obviously you can email me and I can quite happily send that straight to you. But in more general terms, as I said, yeah, it's a combination of the costs of hosting just quite how many images I actually have, and these nefarious third-party scrapers that just mean I do not have the time or the money or the inclination to put everything up online all at once. We then have, why didn't Japan build Junyo and Hiyo as proper fleet carriers from the start, instead of wasting resources on ocean liners that could be converted into mediocre fleet carriers? If it was a question of juggling resources between different building programs, I think they could have just slow-walked their construction and still ended up with more useful ships than the ones that they actually built. There's, well, a couple of big issues. Firstly, slow walk their construction, you're occupying a valuable large slipway for an extended period of time, and one of the things that Japan really has a shortage of is large slipways capable of building large warships. So you definitely don't want to be doing that. And the other big issue is that the whole point of a lot of the Japanese naval build-up in the late 30s, even after they've withdrawn from the treaties, is essentially a big game of smoke and mirrors to try and deceive particularly the US, but the Allies, as they will subsequently be in general, as to what their actual build program and intentions are. Because they know that if they end up in a full-on building race, naval arms race, with either the US or Britain or both, that is not something they can win. They already, kind of figured that out in the 1920s, even if they seemed determined at that point to sink their entire national economy to even try. And that's why they were going, for example, with the Yamato. They knew that they couldn't build the same number of ships as America, so they thought, well, we'll have an individually superior ship, so it doesn't matter if you build 2 for our 1 because our ship is worth 3 to your 1, or something like that. And so with carriers, it was a case of, well, if we build this number of carriers, so obviously they've got Akagi and Kaga at that point, they're building Hiryu and Soryu, and then they'll be building Shikaku and Zuikaku, then they know that the US will probably predicate its carrier building program, at least in peacetime, on a relative basis to the number of carriers that the Japanese are building. If they then lay down 2 more carriers, the Americans will counter that. If they don't, if it seems like they're just building their historical carriers, then the American build program will be smaller, and if they put a little bit of money into multiple other ships, including Hiyo and Junyo, with the idea of then very quickly converting them over to being carriers, even if they're not as good as full fleet carriers, they're still a lot better than nothing, then that will give them a temporary carrier advantage, which they can then use to try and win a short-term war. Because remember, the Japanese were not under any illusions that they could win a long-term knockdown, drag-out struggle with the United States. They were looking at it from a perspective of essentially appearing to have a certain amount of strength, then very quickly, with both the commissioning of the Yamatos, the conversion of these liners into auxiliary carriers, and also other things like swapping the Megamis from 666s to twin 8s and converting the Kitakamis to torpedo cruisers, etc., etc. The idea was in the space of a couple of years to radically transform and upgrade the strength of the Japanese Navy to a point where it could temporarily compete with the US Navy for long enough that they could hopefully beat the US Navy into the ground and then either seek favourable terms to end the war or turtle up behind their planned defensive lines. Because it didn't quite work out, but that was the idea. Lesbian Pan asks, of all the various countries that didn't create an Atlanta or Dido-style anti-aircraft cruiser, who do you think could have made the best one based on their dual-purpose guns, targeting systems, etc., etc.? I think it's quite a difficult one, to be perfectly honest, because if you go through the, 4 other substantial navies of the period, you run into problems with all of them. So the Germans theoretically have a really nice dual-purpose gun available in principle, the 127-128mm, but they don't actually implement it in a naval context until right towards the very end of the war, which means at that point that the best they've got for heavy anti-aircraft use is the 105, which, if the mount will stop breaking down for the next 15 seconds, is a relatively decent AA gun, but it's a little bit on the small side compared to a 5 or a 5.25 inch. So you could make a pure anti-aircraft ship, but an anti-aircraft cruiser with just 105s, I'd be a bit hesitant about that. The French have a dual-purpose gun that's in the right caliber range, the 130mm or 5.1 inch that they use on the Dunkirks. However, by all accounts, the mounting is not particularly successful. So although it is in the right kind of caliber range, it seems that they had a lot of problems trying to use it in a dual-purpose role, and thus if you want a properly effective heavy anti-aircraft gun, for them you have to go down to 100mm, which is what you'd find being used in the Richelieus and stuff. And again, yeah, it's good to have a heavy anti-aircraft gun, not a particularly good dual-purpose gun. It's far too light for a cruiser. So that leaves you with the Italians and the Japanese. And the Italians, much like the previous two, they've got 90mm and 100mm dual-purpose guns, which do a reasonably good job as heavy anti-aircraft guns, but again are really far too light for true dual-purpose armament on a big cruiser, something over 4,000 or 5,000 tons. And then that leaves us with the Japanese, and the Japanese actually do have a couple of potential candidates. They've obviously got the dual-purpose 127mm 50 cal gun, which they put on various destroyers, which I would hesitate to use because it is a dual-purpose gun and it has the right caliber for being a decent surface weapon as well. However, those weapons particularly were known to have trouble tracking targets in World War II because they're a bit too slow. They do have another 127mm weapon, the 40 caliber length Type 89 and Type 88, which is the 5-inch gun you'll typically see on their larger ships as a secondary weapon. Again, it's a dual-purpose weapon. It's not massively long range, but it does have a big enough, nasty enough shell. It could be at least not necessarily in terms of rate of fire, but at least in terms of ballistics, somewhat similar to a 5-inch 38. And they do have 120mm older guns as well, or 4.7 inch, which potentially could be used. So essentially by process of elimination, if anyone's going to even just have the guns to build a decent dual-purpose anti-aircraft cruiser, it's pretty much only going to be the Japanese. Readersaurus asks, why do so few photographs of Shinano exist? One would think that high-ranking admirals would have taken some photos, but it just seems like Shinano is a carrier that history is trying to forget for some strange reason. Well, first of all, you've got to remember the great secrecy that was put on any slipway or dry dock that was dealing with the construction of the Yamato class. And so Shinano, during her build, would have been subject to that level of restriction for quite some time. And then even when she's converted to a carrier, the time between her being launched and then obviously fitted out and sailing is relatively limited. So she's not around for all that much time so that she could be photographed in the first place. And then, of course, you have in the immediate post-war environment the fact that the Japanese burn and destroy an awful lot of records, including very specifically records related to the Yamato class program. So I suspect that even with Shinano's relatively short life, there probably were a decent number of photos taken of her, but most of them probably were destroyed, much in the same way as most of the photos of Yamato and Musashi were destroyed. It's just with those two, there were just so many more of them that percentage survived that makes for a small but decent photo bank. And then there's a chance that more photos might emerge at some point, because over the past 5, 10, 15 years, we have had some situations where people have died, or in some cases their children have died, and basically some version of their descendants has been going through their father, grandfather, great-grandfather's belongings and discovered that while there was a bunch of stuff that was supposed to have been destroyed, in some cases, some Japanese workers and officials did take away plans and photos and stuff, and they just preserved them in secret, and then they've come out. So there was a relatively recent discovery of a batch of plans for the Yamato class that were thought long lost. They weren't full plans, but they certainly fill in a lot of details. And so it's possible there's a few more photos of Shinano floating around somewhere in Japan that we don't know about. But, broadly speaking, the Japanese Navy did a pretty creditable job at trying to wipe out most records of the ship in the first place. B. Huang asks, the US Navy had a plan similar to the Japanese for the conversion of fast ocean liners to aircraft carriers in a time of war. How effective would it have been? Well, since the US Navy never actually implemented its ACV program in a whole range of different iterations they considered in the 30s, it's difficult to foresee. They did consider yet another variant of it during the war itself, and there were thoughts about converting the Normandy into a aircraft carrier, but that was more of an ad hoc thing that was come up with much closer to the actual need. In terms of the long-term plans, as I said, it depends exactly which program you go with, because there were programs that looked at more general merchant ships, so you'd end up with something that would be kind of halfway between an escort carrier and a light carrier in terms of vessels we actually got. There was another idea which was very similar to what the Japanese were doing with Junyo and Hiyo, of sponsoring ocean liners and other large, fast ships to be able to be turned into auxiliary carriers pretty quickly. And there were even more grandiose plans at points to much more heavily subsidize the construction of some of the largest passenger liners in such a way that they were already halfway to aircraft carriers already. I mentioned in that carrier video there was even a plan to try and possibly sponsor a ocean liner that would actually just flat out have a flight deck already, and a small hangar, which would obviously make conversion a heck of a lot easier, because then at that point you just trim the island slightly and take out a bunch of cabins to make a larger hangar, but you wouldn't have to do a superstructure strip down and flight deck installation, because that and elevators and so forth would already be in place. So you pick your plan and choose which one might have been more effective. Generally speaking, I would think that the middle of the road plan probably would have been the most effective, the one where you do essentially Hiyo-Junyo style preparations on a number of ships otherwise designed for civilian service, simply because the conversion of a ship that already has a flight deck would have been slightly faster, but it is still ultimately going to be an auxiliary, not a fully fledged fleet carrier, and the amount of money you'd need to invest to persuade someone to build a flight deck ocean liner in the first place would be so large that you'd only end up with a handful of them, if that, whereas a more Hiyo-Junyo style project, which, as it was considered, would give you a lot more hulls and therefore just a greater amount of effectiveness. And considering that the Independence class worked out pretty well, and the fact the US Navy could produce pilots and aircraft considerably faster than the Japanese could, I think it certainly would have helped quite considerably, especially in late 42, early 43, when the US Navy's true fleet carrier fleet is down to quite a low margin. Brendan Buersdorf asks, if the Lexingtons were unfit for conversion for whatever reason, would the US Navy have constructed sister ships to Ranger, or would they convert something else? Given that Ranger was a compromised design that followed on from the Lexingtons, I don't think they would have built more ships like that, especially if, for whatever reason, as you say, if the Lexingtons aren't suitable for conversion, that's still not stopping the Japanese doing Akagi and Kaga, so they are going to be looking for at least some large carriers to, follow on from that. So step one would possibly be to consider converting some of the South Dakota hulls instead, much as how the Japanese had to use Kaga instead of Amagi. And the next fallback after that, I suspect, would have been to dust off some of the plans that they had already, which, again, I mentioned in that US Navy carrier video, of essentially a purpose-built fleet carrier very heavily based on the Lexington-class hull, and if they couldn't finagle that through the treaty restrictions, then they did have a couple of slightly smaller options they could pick from as well. But they definitely would have been going for a full-sized pair of fleet carriers just so they didn't fall behind the Japanese. Warrant Officer 2528 asks, which would have served the US better in the early interwar period and into World War II? Saratoga and Lexington, as they were historically, or the 6 30-knot 15,000-ton carriers proposed by the Director of Naval Aviation, Captain N E Irwin, back in 1918. Honestly, I think Lexington and Saratoga would have been by far the better choices in those circumstances, for a number of reasons. Firstly, 6 15,000-ton carriers are going to take up substantially more of the US's treaty carrier tonnage allocation than Lexington and Saratoga would do, especially at their declared displacements, which would restrict the US's ability to build other, more modern fleet carriers in the interwar period because they wouldn't have as much tonnage remaining, which would put them on a little bit of a back foot going into World War II, because although they might then have slightly more carrier hulls, 15,000-ton carriers designed in 1918, A, are going to have about 10 years more wear and tear on them than Lexington and Saratoga historically did, and B, they're not going to be able to carry all that large an air group, and they're probably going to have had to undergo a fairly extensive and expensive modernizations just to be able to carry and operate modern aircraft, even in small numbers, compared to the air wings and aircraft types that Lexington and Saratoga could field. So you would have more hulls, but you would have significantly more limited carrier capability. Those hulls also would be considerably more vulnerable, and therefore you're going to be less effective in terms of striking power. You're going to have less modern striking power, and there's a greater chance that you're going to start losing hulls at a fair old rate compared to what happens historically speaking. I mean, yes, okay, Lexington goes down pretty quickly, but still that's only the loss of one hull. If you had a couple of these smaller carriers there with Yorktown instead at Coral Sea, you're going to have less aircraft available, and probably both of those small carriers would go down, assuming that they're both spotted. The other problem, of course, is you look at just how many torpedo attacks Saratoga survived and kept coming back from. 15,000-ton late 1910s carrier, probably going to go down. So each of those torpedo attacks, you're probably losing a carrier as well. Antonius Pius asks, you mentioned the big brawl between Enterprise and Essex crews. It's a very common trope of practically every US-made World War II naval movie that a brawl breaks out. Coincidentally, always in a drinking establishment. I wonder why. Anyway, I don't see that as much, if at all, in British-made World War II movies. Did they just not fight as much in real life, or was it more the filmmakers toning down that aspect of World War II service? Or have I just not seen enough British World War II movies? There certainly were a decent share of bar brawls in the UK between service members during World War II. However, and this is based on my own experience of obviously being in the US and the UK and looking at wartime footage of the US and the UK, but I think, leaving all potential culture differences, etc. aside, I think there was a bit more of an opportunity for bar brawls to break out in the US, simply because certainly in the 1940s, the average British pub, tavern, inn, whatever you want to call your drinking establishment of choice, was a much smaller institution than a lot of the places in the US, particularly in harbours. So you go around Portsmouth and so forth, say today, or Chatham, or any of the other historic British ports, and you'll see that outside of a few fairly obviously more modern buildings, most of the traditional pubs don't have that much capacity, but there's a lot of them to compensate. Whereas from what I've seen in the US, both in terms of historical footage and having been around a few US ports, there's a fair number of US bars and so forth which are considerably larger. They have a much larger capacity than the average British pub. And that means, A, you're going to have more people in there, and so statistically speaking, it's more likely that there'll be someone who'll kick off more generally, but also because there's a lot more people, there's the opportunity to have significant representation from multiple ships' crews present at that establishment. Whereas in most, I'd say, most traditional British bars and pubs of that period, you'd probably either have a shore party from one ship show up and just completely flood several pubs, so there wouldn't be an opportunity for a big party from another ship to be there in the first place, and therefore obviously a brawl can't start between ships' crews if there's only one ship's crew there. Or if they did, it would be maybe a handful of people, and the rest of the pub is full of crew from another ship, and at that point, given the massive odds against them, they would generally be fairly cautious about starting anything because they'd be hugely outnumbered. As I said, that doesn't preclude bar brawls breaking out. They absolutely did. But it just seems that the circumstances of the structures of the British and American drinking establishments lend themselves a bit more in the American ones for this inter-crew conflict. Ashhawk asks, I was re-listening to your HMS Leviathan video, one of my favourite alternate history videos, by the way, and I couldn't help but notice you repeatedly referenced Brunel's engineering of the hull, and I had to wonder, do the continued by the power of Brunel references get to be just tongue-in-cheek, i.e. saying, yeah, we're truly in fantasy territory now, or was he really that good in terms of the hulls he designed, such that it could have served in the Royal Navy for over 100 years? And believe it or not, it's far more reality than fiction. Amongst engineers, certainly engineers in the UK, or at least I should say engineers that do physical engineering, civil, materials, mechanical, that kind of stuff, Brunel is almost the semi-mythical figure when it comes to the sheer durability of practically everything he built. There are numerous bridges, large and small, railway cuttings and embankments, the tunnel that he and his father worked on under the Thames, and all sorts of other macro-scale engineering projects that Brunel had a hand in or directly supervised and designed. And practically all of them survive to this day with a very minimal amount of maintenance required, and often are operating at capacities in terms of load and everything far beyond anything he originally envisaged, and still need a relatively minimal amount of requirement. The guy built safety factors into his designs that were just absolutely ridiculous. Something I heartily approve of, by the way. And it shows in his ships as well. I mean, Great Eastern herself was an absolute pig to take apart when they eventually got round to doing so. And in her service, her real-life service, that is, she withstood all sorts of things that would have destroyed lesser ships outright. She suffered boiler explosions. She went aground a couple of times. She ended up at one point getting the side of her hull ripped out in a manner not dissimilar to that which sank Titanic. The difference is obviously Titanic came to a grinding halt and sank very quickly. On board Great Eastern, despite a socking great rent in the hull, they barely even noticed until they discovered on arrival in port that the draft was a bit deeper than they thought it would otherwise have been. And other ships that Brunel designed showed similar resiliency. The Great Britain, which you can see in Bristol these days, she went straight up aground on the coast of Ireland, and everyone just thought, well, that's it. She's had it, because every ship that went aground on the coast of Ireland up to that point was broken up by the sea very quickly. And then several weeks later, everyone was looking at it going, it's still there in one piece. Maybe we should actually salvage the thing. And then subsequent to that, after her commercial career was over, Great Britain spent decades as a mostly abandoned fuel hulk and then just abandoned in the Falkland Islands, which is not a very pleasant environment for shipping. And while she was gradually decaying, she was still in a good enough condition in the latter part of the 20th century that she was salvaged, brought back in one piece to the UK and restored, which is why she's in Bristol nowadays. Brunel's ships were fantastically durable, and so, well, as all his engineering projects were. So with Great Eastern Leviathan, it's actually not that much of a stretch to consider that the hull itself would be strong enough to survive that long. But obviously, the machinery would need replacement, and she'd undergo multiple upgrades, which is what happens to her in that history video. But her fundamental structure, I'm pretty sure, would be sound enough to withstand that time. Vicky asks a series of related questions, mostly about cruisers. So, as with traditionally with the batteries of questions that she asks, let's answer them all quickfire style. So, what are your thoughts on the proposed modernizations of the Hawkins class to carry 3 twin 8-inch turrets or 4 twin 6-inch turrets all on the centre line, and the modernisation that Effingham actually received to carry 9 single 6-inch, giving her an 8-gun broadside? What would be your ideal modernisation of the Hawkins class? It's a little bit of a difficult one, to be honest, because having either the Effingham style modernisation or 4 twin 6-inch, either way gives you an 8-gun broadside. So essentially you're turning the Hawkins into a kind of Leander, which could have its uses. On the other hand, converting them to have 3 twin 8-inch would make them into a sort of York class, York and Exeter. On balance, I think in hindsight, at the time, the 6-inch armament probably would have seemed like a better idea in the pre-war period. But with hindsight, I think maybe the twin 8-inch modernisation would have been a little bit better, because the Royal Navy was it was perennially short of cruisers generally, but they were building more light cruisers. They weren't building new heavy cruisers, and places like the Mediterranean Fleet were crying out for them. Now, admittedly, a Hawkins with 3 twin 8-inch isn't necessarily going to be a 1-for-1 match for a Zara or anything like that. But if you're modernising them anyway, updating their machinery and everything, having 2 or 3 8-inch carrying cruisers that can then keep up with the rest of Cunningham's 6-inch cruisers and 5.25-inch cruisers in the Mediterranean would certainly give the British ships a bit more heavy long-distance firepower, so they wouldn't have to basically scarper every single time an Italian heavy cruiser appeared over the horizon. Next question is, what if the Hawkins class had been built with their 7.5-inch guns in twin turrets instead of hand-operated single open mounts? Well, if they could make a decently working twin 7.5-inch turret that would fit onto the hull, then I absolutely would support that idea, because I would position the twin turrets basically in A and B mounts, super firing forward, and then as you're working your way back, the first 2 mounting positions aft. So not the absolute stern, but essentially a super firing pair aft. So that would give you 8 guns as opposed to the 7 on the Hawkins historically. So 1 extra gun, and they can all be brought to bear on the broadside. Plus, it would give you, because you're eliminating the wing that's 7.5-inch turret, so it would give you much more space on either side amidships where you could put more secondary guns, so anti-aircraft guns, etc. It would make them relatively viable combatants in the Second World War, and you'd have plenty of space on the stern to do other things like maybe mount aircraft or torpedo launchers or something like that. Then, if the counties had been built with 7.5 rather than 8-inch guns, could the freed up weight have been used to make them better cruisers overall? Not really. The weight savings would be, relatively speaking, small. Certainly not enough to put full-length armour belts on them or anything like that within the scope of the existing tonnage. And ultimately, the 7.5-inch gun does have some fairly significant performance limitations compared to the 8-inch gun. So, you might get a fraction more armour or a fraction more speed on the counties by having twin 7.5s instead of twin 8s, but the downgrade in primary battery firepower would be so great as to make those other savings basically not worth it at all. Then we have, why did so many capital ships have stern torpedo tubes? So it's a bit of a mixed bag. So you have fully stern-mounted torpedo tubes, i.e. tubes designed to shoot primarily aft. Those are seen more in late-era ironclads and pre-dreadnoughts. You do see them on a few dreadnoughts, but not so many. And that's because at that point, especially when people are looking at, say, something like the Spanish-American War, and some, although not all, of the engagements in the Russo-Japanese War, there is this sense that perhaps a battle is going to be a bit more of a swirling, almost melee-style engagement, where you may have targets off your stern that you want to dissuade or get rid of, and therefore having a torpedo tube or two that can send underwater death their way would be a good thing. But as you see engagement ranges increasing substantially during the Russo-Japanese War, it becomes much less likely that you're going to end up with a target in your immediate stern arc if you're a capital ship, and if you are, it's probably going to be further away rather than right up close. And, if it is going to be up close, it's probably going to be a destroyer or a torpedo boat, at which point firing a single torpedo at it's probably not going to help all that much because it'll just dodge or you'll miss. And then they start to disappear at that point. And you still have torpedoes mounted towards the stern, but they tend to be just broadside tubes positioned further aft because it's a convenient place where they can fit them. And the final element from this quickfire round is, what were the best interwar-World War II era destroyers in the anti-surface role, both overall and from each navy? Preferably both as is, and if we compensate for the differences in sensor equipment, crew training and damage control, etc. In straight-up anti-service combat against other destroyers, it's going to be pretty hard to beat the tribals, to be perfectly honest. My top three would probably be the tribals, the Gearings, and the Akazukis. The Gearings, a little bit leery because obviously they come in right towards the end, so do you expect them to do well? The Akazukis, because although they don't have a particularly heavy gun battery in terms of gun caliber, they do have a fair number of them, and they shoot incredibly fast. So in a destroyer engagement where you're just throwing shells downrange as fast as humanly possible and hoping that you'll score multiple hits, there's a certain benefit to the Akazuki's armament. Obviously, there is possible for them to therefore be outranged, or for individual hits that they score to maybe not do quite as much damage, but destroyers tend to be fairly fragile things anyway. So, and obviously the Gearings are quite big destroyers with 6 5-inch 38 guns, etc. But the tribals really are the ones to beat, because you have German destroyers that have bigger guns, but they have significant top weight issues, stability issues, and rate of fire issues. Similarly, some of the French super destroyers, the contre-torpilleers, they also have heavier guns, but they have significant issues with getting them to work at any kind of significant speed, which is a bit of a downside. The US, the Fletchers are good, and obviously the 5-inch 38 gun can fire quite rapidly, but still 5 guns versus 8, and the tribals aren't exactly slow off the mark when it comes to gunfire. And yeah, I mean, the Italians don't have any destroyers that are massively outstanding in the realm of surface combat. So that leaves the tribals, because they're fast, they're quite big, they're quite tough, and they have 8 guns, which have a pretty decent amount of punching power and a decent rate of fire. So yes, they've got a limited torpedo battery, but to be perfectly honest, destroyers torpedoing other destroyers is far less common than destroyers crippling or sinking other destroyers with gunfire. So the ability to just have an 8-gun broadside and chuck that downrange from a big, fast, tough platform makes the tribals pretty difficult to beat, especially towards the latter part of the war once they get radar and radar-directed fire control and so forth. Alternate historian Turtleduck asks, in Hearts of Iron 4, a major strategy I use when playing as Italy or Germany is to use tanks and hard-hitting units to secure the Suez Canal, and once Spain joins the Axis when they see the winds turning, launch a land invasion into Gibraltar, leading to whatever Allied ships are trapped in the Mediterranean being able to be picked off using my naval bombers and fleet. My question is, if this actually happened and Italian and German forces managed to take the Suez Canal and Spain joined the Axis, with German troops and planes taking Gibraltar, effectively cutting off both ends of the Mediterranean, how would British ships in the Mediterranean escape if possible? In the game, once cut off, those ships are trapped with no escape, and I usually manage to sink somewhere between 100 and 200 ships, but I doubt that many would be there in real life. Well, if, let's say, for sake of example, British forces in Egypt collapsed, and that allowed the Germans and the Italians to take the Suez Canal, then obviously the Mediterranean fleet would need to relocate, but they would have advanced warning because, the Germans and the Italians aren't teleporting to the Suez Canal. They'd be advancing through Egypt, and at some point they'd be getting uncomfortably close to both Alexandria and the Suez Canal, at which point the Mediterranean fleet would evacuate either to Gibraltar or through the Suez Canal before it falls into the Indian Ocean, or some combination thereof. And then if Spain joins the war and it looks like Gibraltar's not going to be tenable, then any remaining Allied ships, at that point would be ships in Gibraltar and ships at Malta, would most likely then just evacuate into the Atlantic and out to the UK, because the sequence of events that's necessary for both the Suez and Gibraltar to fall at the same time is essentially impossibly unlikely, because you've got to get Spain involved in the war, which historically they were very loath to, and then once Spain is involved in the war, you've got to actually get enough German troops to the southern end of Spain to actually make an assault on Gibraltar viable. And, having been to Gibraltar, you ain't doing it with paratroops. You drop paratroops onto Gibraltar, you're going to have a slaughter that makes Crete look like a walk in the park, which essentially means you're going to have to be attacking over the little flat area across the airfield straight towards the Rock, which has been fortified for several hundred years specifically to repel that kind of offensive. So I'm not saying you can't do it, but you are going to need a fairly significant build-up of fighting power, and in that time the Royal Navy can make the appropriate decisions that it needs to make in order to safeguard its ships and get them out of the area. There's also the fact that even if somehow magically, like in an RTS game, you manage to flip both Suez and Gibraltar in the same turn, that doesn't magically make the Straits of Gibraltar impassable. It just means that it's now hostile, and if in that case the Royal Navy would obviously gather up as many ships as it could and run the gauntlet as a battle formation, and freshly captured Gibraltar with most of its defences wrecked just isn't in a position to stop them. J.J. Smith asks, firing stuff that wasn't designed to be fired out of the ship's main guns, for military advantage or for some other purpose, when did it stop, or has it stopped? Broadly speaking, that kind of era stops in the middle of the 19th century as smoothbore guns start to go out of style. And that's simply because when you are firing a smoothbore, usually muzzle-loading gun, then realistically the only restrictions for what you can technically fire out of the thing are, will it fit, and how much wadding do you have to put around it to actually make it fire, instead of just being vaguely thrown out at a relatively low velocity. Everything else is up for negotiation. Whereas, once you get into the 1860s and onwards and you start to see rifled guns taking over, initially alongside smoothbores and then supplanting them entirely, rifling makes firing something that is not supposed to be fired out of the main gun a much more problematic affair, because one, it's, if it's not designed to be fired out of the gun, it's not going to have a driving band, which means it's not going to get the rotation, which means its accuracy is going to be horrible. But two, it's very likely at that point that anything you did randomly stuff down the barrel of the gun is going to absolutely wreck the rifling, which is going to make firing normal shells a lot more difficult, if not impossible, and potentially even cause major problems with the gun. And as a result, you're just not going to do it. So once rifled guns become the ship's main armament, if you want to fire something out of it, unless it's confetti or a blank charge or something like that, if it's an actual projectile, that projectile has to be in large part actually designed to be able to be fired out of that gun, because the alternatives are just awful. Michael Moran asks, Zeppelins over England is a 1930s book translated into English written by a German Zeppelin commander. In the book, he indicates that they thought Royal Navy forces in the North Sea actively hunted for Zeppelins after their raids, or were at least used for anti-aircraft duty. Is there any truth to this? There is some truth to that. The Harwich force in particular, which was made up of destroyers and cruisers, which were obviously relatively quick and positioned, roughly speaking, in the Zeppelin's flight path, were given the task of patrolling both to shoot down Zeppelins that were on recon over the sea, but also to try and intercept Zeppelins to, and particularly coming back from, their raids on mainland UK. So there is a certain element of truth to that, although the Harwich Force did note relatively quickly that obviously a Zeppelin was usually going to be faster than even their ships, and thus trying to intercept one and then down it with the relatively limited anti-aircraft fit that they could carry was not a particularly likely to succeed task, although they gave it their best shot. However, as the war went on, they actually did get better at doing so because of the invention of new technologies, particularly when towards the end of the war, when they introduced the towed aircraft lighters, so you could put a one-shot disposable aircraft on a small lighter, the destroyer could tow it at speed, the aircraft would take off, fly up, destroy the Zeppelin, and come back down and have to ditch the pilot, hopefully being recovered. And that actually did work a couple of times. So there is certainly an element of truth to the idea that during the war, the Royal Navy was actively trying to hunt Zeppelins in the North Sea after they'd conducted their raids on UK soil. But the Royal Navy also concluded fairly quickly that a much better and more cost-efficient way of dealing with the Germans was going to be to attack the Zeppelins at their hangars, which is where you get the Tondern raid from. Brendan Buersdorf asks, what is a non-condensing steam engine, and how does it differ compared to a condensing steam engine? I heard the term in regards to an engine on a Civil War Union monitor of the two-turret variety, and I was curious about it. So what it comes down to is that when you are using a steam engine of whatever kind, you feed the steam through the engine cylinders, however many they happen to be, and then the steam is exhausted. At that point, most steam engines used on most ships during the time period the channel covers will have condenser systems on board. So that spent steam will be fed into the condenser where, as the name suggests, it will be condensed back down into water, usually quite hot water, by means of heat exchangers and pumps and so forth. And then that still hot water will be fed back to the boilers where it can be turned back into steam again and used again. So there will be relatively minimal loss of water, and the water is essentially operating in a closed circuit environment. Of course, you will get some losses, but broadly speaking, if you are running a steamship or a steam-powered ship, you then only need to occasionally top up your water tanks, which for most of the period where steam-powered ships exist can be done with either some distilling apparatus, because you only have to distill a small amount of water to top the tanks up, relatively speaking, or if you are operating close to shore, then you'll have a finite amount of time before you run low on boiler water, but you obviously can carry top-up tanks to top up your main tanks, and you can pop back ashore to grab some more water. So that's the normal way of doing a steam engine. Of course, to have the condenser and the heat exchanger and the pumps, etc., 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 it adds weight and bulk to the engines. And also, usually speaking, a condensing system will usually, although not always, tend to be of a somewhat lower pressure compared to a non-condensing engine. Now, a non-condensing engine, as the name suggests, it doesn't have any of those systems, so it's smaller, lighter weight, and more compact. However, every time steam cycles through the engine and produces work, once it reaches the end, it just is expended into open air. And that's one of the reasons why non-condensing engines tend to have to be a somewhat higher pressure, because you have to have enough energy in the steam to be able to utilize it and get a decent amount of work out of it in the engine itself. But the remaining steam pressure has to be high enough to allow you to vent that used steam, although still with a fair bit of energy, into the atmosphere as a whole. So steam trains, steam locomotives, are normally, not always, but normally non-condensing steam engines. They have to top up their water tanks, and obviously, they have steam coming out of their funnels and to a certain extent also out of their pistons, and their range is more often than not defined more by how much water can they carry compared to how much fuel they can carry, because usually they can carry more coal than so the coal can generate energy to go a longer distance than water, hence why on steam railways you have to have water tanks and towers and everything to top up the engine at a relatively frequent set of intervals. There are a few condensing steam engines, but because the condenser system, as I said, is this big heavy attachment, and unlike a ship where it can just all sit in the engine room, a steam train then has to haul around its own condenser as well as its normal load. It's generally held to be more cost efficient to just have water towers. Now, of course, that's not always the case with steam locomotives, because sometimes, especially if you've got very long routes through fairly rough terrain, it can be better to have the slightly less haulage capacity of a condensing steam locomotive, which would then allow it to actually make that full journey without having to stop and top up water towers, etc. And the thermal efficiency of a condensing locomotive is absolutely higher than a non-condensing one, but because it has to haul that heavy condenser around with it, it can't carry quite as much in terms of trucks or carriages, etc., etc. Now, in terms of ships at sea, you would only really ever want to use a non-condensing steam engine if either you've just slapped an engine in and it happens to be an ex-locomotive engine, and therefore it's not designed to have a condenser, and you're in a bit of a rush, or you are building something that is only ever going to use its engine as an auxiliary, and therefore the fact that you only can have a finite amount of use out of it isn't too much of an issue, because you've got water tanks and therefore you know how much use you can get out of it. Or if you're operating in a coastal environment and you expect to only be out and about for a short amount of time, and then you can obviously drop back into a friendly harbour to replenish your water stocks, then you might use a non-condensing engine, again, to minimise the size of and weight of your machinery. But you know that, again, you have a finite lifetime before you need to head off to top up your water. Because in theory, yes, you can just suck water in from the sea, but only if you hate your boilers and you don't want them to last very long. And on top of that, of course, if you're operating primarily in freshwater rivers, you might have a bit more luck going with a non-condensing steam engine, because at least you won't get the excessive mineral deposits you'll get from salt water, but you will still get a lot of other pollution of your engine system from whatever muck is in said river water. Jim Smitty's Timelines asks, I'm currently reading Fortress Malta by James Holland. On page 26, he states the Royal Navy was mistrustful of submarines in general, and yet on the next page he points out that not all officers thought this way, and they were attempting to get money to build underground submarine pens on Malta. My question is, just what was the official Royal Navy position on submarines during the interwar period, and do you have any more information on the proposed submarine pens at Malta? In terms of the interwar attitude of the Royal Navy, it waxed and waned when it came to submarines. They felt that their own submarines would be quite useful in wars to come, mostly because, as far as they were concerned, they had ASDIC, aka sonar, and as far as they were aware, everybody else either didn't or was significantly behind them. However, they were somewhat sceptical, certainly some officers were very sceptical, of the utility of submarines in general in future wars, because of the nature of the ASDIC systems that the Royal Navy had, and in some exercises they'd been quite effective. And so some Royal Navy officers didn't really trust that submarines would have a huge part to play in the next war, because they thought that the submarine issue was a solved problem. Essentially, they thought by pinging away madly with ASDIC, the one thing that kept submarines safe, which was their stealth by being underwater, would be negated, and then they would be relatively easily destroyed. Whereas other officers pointed to the exercises where the ASDIC systems hadn't been as effective, and of course the submariners themselves thought that there were certainly ways of getting around those systems, and therefore though they were considerably more in favour of submarines. Now, in terms of Malta, yes, in the mid-1930s there was a proposal to establish a large underground base for submarines, And the idea was that it would have tunnels which could support 6 separate individual submarines, plus obviously magazines, armories, crew quarters, and restock and resupply bunkers, as well as the ability to transfer the supplies to the sub. So the idea was you could feed torpedoes, food, etc. into this system, which was going to be about 200 feet underground, dug out of a cliff face. And once you'd stocked up that base, then essentially nothing could touch it, and you'd be able to operate this 6-strong force of submarines quite nice and happily. Work did commence, and initially it was thought it would be fairly easy because the rock of the cliff that they'd chosen was relatively speaking soft as far as rock goes. But then increasing costs of excavation, as well as demands for other things, that for the other uses for the cash, meant that the project gradually stalled out. And as a result, although they were based relatively near to where these tunnels were supposed to be dug, the submarines in Malta during World War II tended to have to spend significant portions of the day on the seabed to avoid the attentions of Axis bombers. The tunnels themselves still can, to a certain degree, be visited because they partially completed 3 of the submarine accommodation tunnels before the whole effort was abandoned. So if you're of a bit of an adventurous sort, I believe you can actually visit them and have a poke around. And finally, John McCarthy asks, in designing a ship, especially one significantly different from existing ones, how do the engineers decide on the ship's lines? I'm sure they consider similar designs, but are there other tools, or is it largely trial and error? And in a related question, how is it that the vibration issues with the USS North Carolina weren't caught in tank testing? When designing a ship's lines, generally engineers will fall back on 2 sets of data, at least in the time when they're doing what you might consider to be fully scientific design processes. One will be, as you said, similar designs, i.e. hulls that do similar things, i.e. a known body of work. And the other thing will be calculation. So because different types of hull form are better for different types of things, whether you want speed, maneuverability, specific kinds of speed, certain stability issues, etc., etc., there will be a whole body of existing work, plus, certainly from the 19th century onwards, various formulas that can be used to work out roughly what kind of hull lines will fit a specific kind of ship. Much prior to Froude and people such as him in the 1860s and 70s. Before that, it's a lot of just looking back at previous designs and working out what worked then and what might work now. But once you get Froude tanks and all of this kind of thing, you can use a mixture of formulas, calculation, and preceding knowledge to estimate what a ship's lines should be like, at least in the broad form of things. And then you can run tank testing where you put a scale model in, run it up at a simulated speed, and then you can make refinements to that model in order to improve its efficiency or whatever other aspect of the hull's performance that you want to actually try and optimize. So there's a degree of trial and error, but for the most part, you tend to land roughly in the ballpark and then make refinements, and that's the trial and error process. In terms of the vibration issues with the North Carolinas, this, to a certain extent, does highlight the limitations of scale model testing, because there are plenty of things that a scale model testing can absolutely reflect, either directly or by scaling up the factors that you encounter with various formulas. And that's why it's so useful. However, there are some things that don't really survive the square cube law when you're scaling things down, such as materials, for instance. So if you want to make a 1 to 200 or a 1 to 92 scale or 1 to 72 or whatever, a large tank testing model, if you directly scale down the materials that you're going to be using, so hull plating, etc., you'll end up with something that is largely made of such absurdly thin bits of metal that it will either collapse under its own weight or very rapidly be torn to pieces by the force of the water in the tank as you run it through the tank. Which then leads to, well, if you make it just strong enough, so massively out of scale thicknesses, out of metal, you're going to end up with something that's going to have negative buoyancy, which also doesn't work. And that's why, among other reasons, a lot of tank test models for the period the channel covers are made of wood. And we usually with some kind of modelling compound on it, which you can shape and smooth, etc., etc. Because, of course, if you just have a wooden hull model, which you sometimes would do, the only thing you can do with a purely wood model is plane it back. And if you go too far, you can't put stuff back on, hence the modelling compound, which allows you to build up and take down various bits of the lines as necessary. And so, obviously, you're not building a solid block of wood and clay in real life, but that's probably the best margin, the best material to use when you are doing a tank test. Within reason, there are other materials you might use in a tank test for various other purposes, but anyway. And similarly, material strength will not necessarily scale all the time. Yeah, we covered like tin foil thickness hull plating, which might be in scale, but is completely useless in terms of resistance to the water because water density hasn't changed. But you can also end up in situations where even if turbulent flow is being created on a scale appropriate to the model, or differences in flow pressure and so forth, or even vibration, which can be a result of the previous two, the problem is at that point, even if everything has scaled perfectly in that respect, the amount of force being generated at that small scale may not be really all that much relative to the materials that the model is made of, and thus the problem theoretically may be replicated, but the results on the ship, in terms of, will the ship vibrate and bounce around a lot, might very well not be, because both of the material type and the consistency of the material that's used to make the model simply won't react in the same way that a full-size ship will under significantly greater forces. And thus you can end up with a tank test model that seems to be just fine, but if you scale it all up to real life, suddenly is significantly less than fine. And that's it for this video. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again in another video soon. Bye for now.